I see this often with runners who get injured. Suddenly they're lost, not because they couldn't run, but because they no longer know who they are without the running. When somebody loses touch with that why, that's when we see motivation tank, consistency tank, because they don't have that deeper connection at the core to what they're doing. Instead of chasing these outcomes, I'm trying to cultivate skills in athletes.
Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. Today we're exploring the psychology behind endurance sport. So why people train the way that they do, how mindset shifts performance, and what really keeps athletes motivated over the long term. My guest is Coach D. Stasulli, head coach and owner of Zeal Endurance Coaching. So D brings together an academic background in kinesiology, currently also doing a PhD in the area, also has a decade of coaching experience, and she actually has her own athletic career across trail running, gravel, and multi-sport events. So she holds a master's in kinesiology, teaches anatomy and physiology at college level, and is certified across ultra running, strength and conditioning, triathlons, and performance coaching. So today, Dee and I dive into so much stuff around psychology in sport, identity, motivation, perfectionism, community, and the psychological patterns that she sees in athletes of every background. Let's jump straight into it. All right, Dee, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you. And I know our audience won't know, but we had an unbelievable conversation last week. So I'm beyond excited to be able to dive into kind of just so many aspects of exercise, but in particular the psychological aspect to it as well. I know you're studying so much in that field, and I think that's where I want to go first. Right, you've such an interesting career trajectory. So you were in med school. You were telling me you did biological science, and then you went into coaching, kinesiology. I'm currently doing your PhD as well at the moment. So yeah, tell me a bit about that transition. Like, why move from the area of med school into where you are now?
Yeah, some people might say that I just can't make up my mind and I keep bouncing around, but honestly, I just have a lot of different interests and I I like to say I've almost come full circle. So I started out in the biological sciences in my undergraduate degrees, and then I went to med school immediately after. And I had high hopes of becoming like a missionary doctor and working with underserved populations. But I had a pretty life changing experience in Kenya where I was volunteering over the summer between my first and my second year of med school. And I was working as a student doctor in a rural hospital in Kenya. And it made me realize that I was constantly going to be behind the eight ball, working with populations like this in areas like this in the world. The real root issues that were coming up were a lack of resources, the global policy issues, a need for education. And this really prompted me to leave med school because I wanted to have a deeper impact and try to get ahead of that curve in a sense. And so I left med school in my second year and I decided to dive more into human movement, and I got my master's in kinesiology. I started working as a strength coach and then teaching anatomy and physiology and pathophysiology on the college level. And then I was strength coaching and then eventually started my endurance coaching business as well. And over the past couple years of doing that, I started to realize that what intrigued me the most wasn't just the physiology, but also the human behavior piece. The why do people push? Why do they quit? Why do two athletes with identical physical ability perform differently under pressure? And endurance sports became that bridge for me. I was an endurance athlete for a long time. I've been an athlete across many sports for my whole life, and I saw how training impacted people's identity, their self-worth, their ability to emotionally cope in sport and in life, their overall resilience. And coaching really just felt like the most integrated way to impact both the biological and the psychological dimensions there of performance. So sports psychology didn't feel so much like a pivot at the end. Um, I feel like I'm filling the missing gap in my educational knowledge that wasn't quite filled throughout my previous education. But now I like to say that I'm in the preventative health space because I'm working with people on their fitness, their physical and their mental health, and hopefully keeping them away from the doctor's office and keeping them out there doing the things that they love for a really long time.
Yeah, you most definitely are in the preventative kind of health space as well. And It's such an interesting transition. Like when you were in Kenya or having those experiences regarding med school, did you just know like there's like a piece of you like maybe not fulfilled or just missing?
Yeah, it definitely was eye-opening because I went in there, with this save the world mentality as many, American people do, and I thought I was gonna make huge impact, and it just felt really difficult to see so much loss and so much struggle there that it felt like I wasn't going to be able to find my place in that cycle, of like where do I break that cycle or how do I get ahead of this curve? And although I'm not working with underserved populations necessarily right now, I feel like I'm ahead of that curve in the sense that I am working on people's health and well-being, but a little bit upstream.
And it's like it's some of the best and most cost effective way that you can be preventative right in this space as well. So it seems like you're in a wonderful area, and yeah, you're just doing what you love at the moment. Um, wait, when we were talking last week as well, you mentioned you worked not limited to, I assume, but just primarily with adults or non-professional athletes across many backgrounds. Like, what grew you to that specific demographic or person to work with?
Yeah, I appreciate the fact that, non-professional athletes are navigating sport inside real life. So they have careers, families, they're dealing with their own mental health, identity transitions across the lifespan. And that complexity is where the most meaningful growth lives, in my opinion. They're not chasing medals for income, they're chasing meaning in their life. They're looking for a sense of competence, maybe healing, self-discovery. And to me, that depth is incredibly rich work. It feels very rewarding. And that's kind of what keeps me waking up in the morning, is knowing that I'm part of this small piece in these individuals' lives that gives them meaning.
Yeah, and to your point, like the psychological aspect, it's important no matter what. If you're a professional athlete, like 100%, but you're not only navigating the sporting side. Well, that's your niche, we'd say, when someone comes to work with you. But you also have to factor in all the other areas of the life that they do have, right? Because they still exist. It's not like you can just black them out when you're dealing with them in a sporting context. So there's a lot of dynamics at play there as well. The one word that you brought up a lot last week was curiosity, right? I think you talked about curiosity a bit, both as a coach and an athlete. What does curiosity mean in the context of endurance sport to you?
Yeah, this is a term that comes up a lot for when I'm working with my athletes, when I'm talking to them, and I think it's a really important tool that we have, and a very important performance tool. I think it's something that kind of keeps the spark lit in people as opposed to it burning out. And it's something that brings awareness to the present moment. It helps people remain adaptable and in this learning kind of mindset. I like to think of it as like courage in motion because a lot of times we are in judgment mode. And when you're judging something, it collapses, it constricts, you know, and the curiosity piece is something that can expand it. So the moment you judge something, you put a label on it, you are closing the door on opportunity. But if you stay curious, you're leaving that door open. You stay open to the possibilities of what's on the other side of it. So I'm trying to with when I'm working with athletes, I'm trying to help them reframe their judgment into curiosity. It allows us to stay soft and aware instead of like really harsh and reactive in situations that become challenging. So instead of asking what's wrong with me, I'm asking why did this happen? You're staying curious to like what we can learn from a given situation. One athlete that I had used to say, "I really suck at hills," and this is a common thing in with endurance athletes. It causes a lot of athletes to avoid choosing hilly races even. So we reframe that to like what happens to you on the hills, or like how can we look at this hill as a challenge, or something that we can tackle and something we can learn from instead of something that we automatically close the door on at the bottom of that hill. It's like, oh, here's a hill, I'm out. you know. So it's courage in motion. It's leaving yourself open to the possibility of growth in that moment.
The hill is a fascinating one for me because it's almost like a metaphor in a way, right? You have to like climb up a hill. So people might just have, obviously, physically, it'll feel maybe slightly different than we're running on a flat surface, but then the psychological component of actually having to climb up a hill as well has its own dynamics. I think that's a cracking example.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating concept to me too. It's like it's something that can easily just turn these pieces of data that we use to judge ourselves on, the numbers, you get caught up in that, into information. Purely it's just information that teaches us something. And so if you're in that mindset of like of curiosity, it being at the forefront, it means that there really isn't an opportunity for failure. There's only growth opportunities. And I think that's extremely powerful. It allows people to stay in this playful mindset with sport, not making it another chore or something that they have to live up to meet certain standards or expectations. It turns athletes into lifelong learners. Like there's always room to grow. And the moment that you close the door on that curiosity, I think, is the moment that you stop growing.
And kind of in line with the being long-term loner, long-term learners. Even though I know it can be endurance running can be a lonely place at times. When someone comes to you with a certain performance goal, how do you help them then to maybe lean into their curiosity or discover their deeper why as well?
Yeah, that's it's a tricky one because I think when you are tapping into someone's why, this topic has gotten a lot of attention lately. It cannot come off sounding cliche almost. It's like fluffy, um it, it's not just this motivational wallpaper of like finding your why, right? It is the psychological architecture that underpins your resilience. And so when we break it down, I'm looking at like what makes up all the pieces of that architecture. That comes down to a person's values, their life story, the narrative that is running through their head, what emotionally resonates with them. And this is a deeply personal topic, and but I really think that it is the foundation of performance. If you have a really weak why, you're more likely to give up on yourself when the going gets tough. And I think it's that quiet story that lives in every one of us. It's the story not just in sport, it could even be the story behind why somebody pursues a particular career path or why they live in a certain area of the country or the world. And it speaks to the essence of who we are as a person when you really get to the root of it. It's like, why does this matter to you? Why does this sport matter to you? Who are you becoming through this sport? And I think the beautiful thing about it too is like it evolves across the seasons of life. So it's something that we can revisit at various phases of life to see how it is evolving with that person. But I think staying in touch with it is extremely important because when somebody loses touch with that why, that's when we see motivation tank. That's when we see consistency tank because they don't have that deeper connection at the core to what they're doing.
Yeah, and I came across a study. I must try and get it again. I'll put it in the show notes, but it's pretty fascinating, right? Where adult athletes, they were asked what kept them in the sport in the long term. And you think performance might be like top, and I think it didn't even appear in the top three. Like the top ones were based around identity, which we'll definitely get into in this podcast, community, and then also personal mastery. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts around that. Like, how often would you see that play out? Like when someone thinks that their why is about the race, but really it's actually deeper than that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of athletes think that they do their sport for those outcomes, but if you peel back the layers, more often than not, most people have a deeper reason for why they're out there. And if they don't, if they truly do get into the sport because they are excited by those external pieces of validation, the podium wins or the medals or the PRs, the data, the rankings, all of that. If they're truly motivated by that, I see that flame burn out pretty quickly. And if we do not connect to a deeper why in those individuals, it's we're on shaky ground there. So I find it to be something that underpins performance largely.
How does that surface? Like just general like inconsistency with training. You can probably get some, I was going to say internal narratives, but if they're expressing it to you, more external narratives, like they're kind of discussing with you how frustrated they might have been with a particular aspect of the race. Like how does that show up for an athlete when you feel that they're not connected to their deeper why? What are some indicators?
Yeah, I see them becoming overly attached to metrics. I can see the consistency wax and wane, depending on what's on the calendar, honestly. If they are choosing events to put on the calendar that are more for external appearances, or somebody else said it was a good idea to do this race, or this would get them to X, Y, and Z place down the road, but they're not really excited about it, or they don't have a deeper reason for doing that event other than somebody else said that this was a good idea, or that they saw on social media that this was the race to be at, right? This is the popular thing to do. But I find that those are really weak associations to have. When you're out there, especially in endurance sport, on a day-to-day basis, grinding away, you're putting in so many hours of training, and the racing is just a really small blip on the radar, in the grand scheme of things. So we have to we have to move into more of a process orientation in order to sustain that over the long haul, because the outcomes only come every couple months, and it's very hit or miss as to whether or not you're actually going to achieve the outcome that you want on the day. It's whether or not your body is going to show up. How did the training go in that interim period? How was the build? Did you get sick before the race? Life stress factors in. There's so many unknowns that factor into what happens on that performance day. And so I see athletes that overly focus on that often end up disappointed. And then they start to hate that interim period of the training, which is the process. And I think that if you really learn to fall in love with the process, the outcomes become less devastating when they don't go the way that you plan.
Yeah, it's not like they're irrelevant or they don't matter. It's just you're able to put some context behind it and almost see you can see the bigger picture versus just solely relying on the race for say in this example.
Yeah, I think that I see this obsession with the outcome in these athletes, and I think that's one like a really fast track to psychological volatility, just this big roller coaster up and down emotions. And so instead of chasing these outcomes, I'm trying to cultivate skills in athletes. Like I use the phrase mastering your craft a lot because I want athletes to really fall in love with that process of like becoming a master at the craft, whatever that sport may be. And I don't know if you've read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear.
An absolute favorite, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's excellent. I love his idea here of like building systems, not just setting goals. He says you don't rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. And I think that really speaks to the process. Like that's your base, right? That's your foundation that you're building off of. And you can always fall back to that system. And if your system is really solid, then your performance over the long haul is going to be really solid as well.
Yeah, you just quoted the most quoted quote ever on the podcast. Oh yeah, very very much aligned with you there. And just to go back a little bit, I love what you said about um doing things because someone else did it or they heard about it on social media. I think that can even extend further out, just general health. When people are trying to improve their health habits, they might tend to pick up trends. Like I admit, a lot of things online are actually gimmicks as well, right? They don't really have too much substance. And when you try to apply something to your life that you don't really have an intrinsic motivation to do, or might even fit your lifestyle at the moment in time that you're in as well. So much harder to sustain. And then the result of that, like if you will say do poorly in a race, is to self-sabotage, look inwards at yourself, like what am I doing wrong, versus trying to understand is the system I have in place actually, do I have a system in place, number one? And if I do, is it actually serving my needs in this moment in time as well? So I think a lot of people can fall victim to that. I think that's why so many apps and health apps are out there as well to try and steer people in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same problem that I have with, uh, like, static training plans, and people can pull off the internet or have AI generate now at this point, and they follow it, and it's just very cookie cutter, and it's not built around them as an individual, a human with unique physiology, with unique psychology, with unique life circumstances. That training plan is not fit to any of those things. And it's really like throwing eggs at the wall and hoping one doesn't break, right? And I think that when people learn how to tie things back to their individual circumstances, their needs, like you said, their values, and then getting back to that deeper why for themselves, I think that's when you can really see the outcome, the performance outcomes become a really nice side effect of just falling in love with that process, because that process was built by you, and it's uniquely designed around you and what you need to get out of your sport.
Is that how you get people who might have fallen out with their why to realign, kind of showcasing that it's so unique and so individual to them? Is that one of the tools you'd use?
Yeah, and sometimes athletes come to me and they ask like, "What should my why be?" Like, I can't pick that. That's not. It's so deeply personal, and they have to really do some deeper digging within themselves. And that sometimes that's hard for athletes who've never done that before, especially athletes who maybe don't have the best self awareness, or if they haven't ever done deep work, like gone to therapy or something, where they're really trying to dig in and ask themselves the hard questions. That's when sometimes I have to pull out some of the hard questions and make them think. Even in a rhetorical sense, just send them home with some thoughts to dig into, like why they're really doing this beyond their friend asked them to sign up for a race, or their parents told them that they should do a sport in high school.
Yeah, I think that actually ties very nicely into our next topic, just around identity. And I came across like a psychology concept called identity foreclosure. There's a few ways of describing it. Like when someone's sense of self becomes overly tied to one role, it can also be that you've been given this identity but never really questioned why. So your example about my parents put me into this sport when I was young, so now it's part of my identity. Um, I imagine endurance sport can create this, especially in athletes who place all their work on performance, like we were discussing. So it is something that you see within your coaching.
The concept of athletic identity or identity foreclosure.
Y- Yeah, like the athletic identity. So I think it might be good to go into like what is a athletic identity? How do you see it show up across maybe beginners and long time runners or even master athletes?
Yeah. Uh, I I see this all the time, and it goes both ways. I see athletes that over-identify and those that under-identify as an athlete, and it's a whole spectrum in between. So, athletic identity is defined as just how much an individual defines themselves through sport. And the healthiest version of this is when sport is a meaningful part of life, but it's not the only thing that gives somebody their value or their self-worth. So it can be incredibly empowering. It can give structure, motivation, meaning to a person's life, being able to call themselves an athlete or saying that they participate in a sport, they do hard things. People love to feel like they are a resilient individual, and sport teaches us so much of that. But when someone sees themselves only as an athlete, their self worth becomes super fragile. Their whole world can wobble when training goes sideways, like when they get injured, for example, or they go through a, a, a big change in life that causes sport to um, lose a little bit of its role or place in their day-to-day life. I see this often with runners who get injured. Suddenly, they're lost, not because they couldn't run, but because they no longer know who they are without the running, you know? And that moment honestly becomes a really great opportunity to try and rebuild a person's identity into a healthier, more expansive version. And I think that it's as a coach, it's my job to build an identity ecosystem, so to speak. So that sport is it's an important chapter, but it's not the entire book in a person's life.
And do you encourage or do you help people build other identities, or do you just ask kind of probing questions to showcase that they have more than one identity? Because I presume the majority of people would, right? You might consider yourself as just an athlete, but when you probe and ask questions and coach, you probably see they have loads of facets to their life that they mightn't even realize are part of their identity as well.
Yeah, I think people can get really caught up in the glamour. Social media does not help with this, but like the glamour of sport, the outcomes that come from it, the numbers, the data, the metric, like how do I stack up against others? Like this comparison culture can come into sport very readily, and especially with how much exposure we get on social media to what other people are doing, and that can cause people to um, really start to over identify with their athlete identity. And I have to remind them of the different roles that they play, especially with the demographic that I work with of adult professional athletes. I have to remind them like you are not only an athlete, but you are a mom and a working professional and a husband or wife and a caregiver to aging parents, and you're wearing all of these hats, versus a professional athlete who might wear only one or two hats, over the course of their week. And it becomes a lot easier to juggle those two things. But I can see my demographic of athletes gets really, um, they can get really uh, disenfranchised with seeing the successes of other people who don't have the same circumstances that they have.
Yeah, the comparison is the thief of joy is the quote coming to my mind right now as well. Around that, I'll admit that, um, and I've done a few talks on this as well. Like my natural tendency, right? I'd be pretty competitive sports wise, just in general. And when I see someone in my domain, we'll say whether it's Irish football or soccer, and they're doing well, I'll admit my first knee jerk emotion is jealousy. I get jealous. I'm like, how are they like like they're doing so good? But then I'm able to reframe it and think about it, and it turns into, okay, why am I jealous? Oh, they're good at what aspects are they good at? Is there something I can adapt? How can I improve myself in this area, whether it is sport or career wise as well? So it starts off as like a really negative thing, and I think I can adjust it to become like a positive twist and just like a self, a personal growth, and a project that I make with myself as well. Do you experience that with your athletes, or is that something that you try to train if they are looking on social media and they're going, oh, so and so did better than me this week, or how do you navigate that without it turning into a self-sabotaging, kind of internal narrative?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot to unpack there. I think I get a lot of self-sabotage that comes up in my athletes, and I get a lot of imposter syndrome and a lot of comparison. And I have to address all three of those things as early as possible before it starts to spiral in athletes, because that's when they can lose lose that process orientation. They can lose they they can lose their love for the sport, and it can cause them to leave the sport. And I think that it's something that can have a really negative impact on their mental health if we don't address it early, and to I have to almost check in with it really often as well. So, like when I see an athlete that's over identifying with their athlete identity, I need to make it more multidimensional for them. So we're talking about how they're doing not just as an athlete, in our coaching conversations. We're talking about how they're doing as a human. How are they doing at home? How are their kids doing? Like what's work been like? We're talking about all these different aspects of their identity so that they remember that they're not just an athlete. They're not just the numbers. They're not just the data that's coming through that we're going to talk about and assess progress. We are going to measure their growth on a larger scale with a broader lens. And I think that's a really powerful way of reframing someone's identity outside of sport. Even though I am the coach and I'm obviously focused on the sporting aspect more specifically, I always try to bring it back to the whole human.
Yeah, the word holistic was like I was just going to say it, so you beat me to it. Do you ever get severe resistance to that? Do you ever get anyone that says, "D, look, like you're my running coach. I don't need these life lessons." Or do you ever get anything like that? Or are most people, which I would assume are receptive and want that?
Yeah, I haven't had too much pushback. Sometimes the athlete will try to steer the conversation back to this is especially true with my very type A athletes, my very like high performing athletes who are very competitive. They will uh they'll start bringing up, they'll mention these little things about, oh, I saw this person doing this, or I saw this on Strava, and maybe I should be doing this thing. And it's almost always like a gimmick or some kind of hook that they they saw on social media or like the latest trend. And I have to walk them back to some of the foundational aspects of what we're getting at with the training on a day-to-day basis. Again, going back to that process so that we can build longevity in the sport, because my athletes know, this is a big principle of mine, that I won't take shortcuts just for the short-term gains. There may be a faster way to get to where you want to get to, but it comes with a cost. And that cost could be injury risk. That cost could be early burnout. It could be leaving the sport earlier than you otherwise wanted to, just just because of mental and physical burnout. So like I'm playing the long game here, and we're going to take the little steps to master that process so that you can do this sport for as long as possible, for as long as you want to, and enjoy it as long as possible.
Yeah, that's such a clever insight because I'm sure you have the capability, right? If someone comes into you, I'm sure you could, whether it's working them to the bone, you could give them a very aggressive program. They do good in the initial race. You're like, look what I made you do. But it's not about that. Like you said, it's more about the long term, the longevity, the process side of the sport versus, yeah, winning the actual race.
Yeah, and with my highly driven athletes, my highly competitive, performance-oriented athletes, most of what I'm doing is slowing them down. And like, I feel like I'm putting like the reins on them, and I'm just like, easy, easy, pull back a little bit, like we're gonna get there, but we don't need to get there, tomorrow. And I'm trying to get them to I'm trying to remind them on a day-to-day basis of like, "Hey, like, are you present? Are you enjoying what you're doing?" Because they're so focused on that thing that's coming up on the schedule, that's down the road, that they really wanna do well at. But I'm in the seat here of looking at like, "No, this is a daily habit. This is part of your lifestyle, Let's make sure that we enjoy it now, not just when or if we get the desired outcome on race day."
Yeah, and with your, we'll say, type A or high performers, perfectionism is kind of coming to mind. Like, where does perfectionism appear most in endurance athletes?
I see it in my high performers a lot, the very type A, high achieving adults. They're looking for that performance-based validation, and I can also see it masking, like, insecurity. So athletes that don't have as much, confidence in themselves can be overly perfectionistic in their day to day. They get really caught up in like, did I do this perfectly? Oh, if I didn't do it perfectly, then I'm a failure. It immediately spirals into shame. And this is regardless of whether or not the perfectionism is stemming from a place of insecurity or if it's stemming from a place of ambition. It's underlying that is this sense of shame. Like, if I don't perform perfectly, then I am not worthy. of whatever it may be, of being called an athlete, of, being worthy of, just worthy in general even. Like, I struggle with this concept because, well, first of all, it's very relatable to me. I definitely have, very strong perfectionistic tendencies, and I struggle with trying to help athletes realize that good enough is actually a much healthier way of progressing through their sport, through other aspects of their life, than constantly having this bar that is just out of reach.
Yeah,
And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I think some athletes have this perfectionism built into them because they are afraid of failure, and they try to overcompensate by being perfect in their execution. And I think sometimes they're also afraid of success
Mm.
because that when you achieve that outcome, then you are successful. As a perfectionist, then you have to raise the bar, right? And you continue to raise the bar, and it becomes further and further out of reach, becomes this impossible standard. And I think that makes a lot of perfectionistic athletes, I see them burn out because they're constantly striving for this carrot on a stick that they can never reach.
Yeah, that's such an interesting perspective. Like if someone is, like I've done talks on like the 80-20, like the 80% good enough is still great, right? And if you're always trying to go, we'd say 100, 110 or whatever more percent, certain people, you're right, are setting themselves up for failure, and they can't actually meet that bar long term. And then we talked about like things like shame or coming in, questioning your identity. There is it's a really old concept, and I'm sure you've heard of it. Is it the Yerkes Dodson law, just showing that like performance under pressure kind of follows like an inverted U curve, right? So if you have too little stress, you don't rise to the moment or succeed. But if you have too much stress, you might choke, for lack of a better phrase. I feel like endurance athletes live on that curve, and even as you're talking, you're giving me kind of people who are positioned like all over that curve as well. Like, how do you help people find the sweet spot there? So you have to stress them to improve, but you can't over stress or for too long a period, because it could lead to burnout or reduced performance.
Yeah, it's really tricky, and it really depends on the individual, honestly, because there's I I'm always trying to find that sweet spot in that inverted U. We want to be like right in the center. What is that optimal level of stoke, right? Just not too high, not too little, that Goldilocks formula. But for different individuals, that there could be a different way of getting there. Some prefer and perform better to be on the higher side of that arousal curve. Some perform better when they're on the calmer side of the arousal curve, and some need to be right in the middle. And the way to get somebody to their optimal level of stoke varies widely. So I'm constantly trying to ask the athlete, like, what gets you excited, to race? Like, what calms you down? What are the things that trigger you? And obviously, the triggers are things that we wanna maybe avoid, because they would either push somebody, to the far end of the spectrum, that where they're over aroused, or it could even take them out of the game, because they are so under aroused. So it looks different for different athletes. Sometimes it has to do with listening to music before the event. Some people need to meditate. Some people need to read. Some people need to be around friends, community, have some laughter. Some people need to be completely alone and just in their own head, getting into a nice calm headspace by themselves. So it's a really fascinating concept, and something that I've learned recently is it has piggybacked on that Dotson kind of framework to expand it into the fact that there is cognitive dimensions of anxiety and physical dimensions of anxiety, or somatic anxiety. So some athletes do really well with the cognitive side of anxiety. They are excited and anticipating, a little bit anxious about the unknowns that are in front of them in that performance setting. And they like that uncertainty. They know that they're going into a performance environment and they're going to be challenged in different ways. And that would fall into the cognitive anxiety category. And then there's the physical anxiety, which are more of the symptoms that most people would be familiar with, that racing heart rate, the increased breathing, maybe the butterfly feeling in your stomach. And um, some people need a little bit of that to get them to that optimal level of arousal. And it's usually a combination of the two that is going to influence how well a person performs that day. But if the cognitive anxiety is too high, or even if the somatic anxiety is too high, or if they're both too high, that's when we can start to see performance decrements.
I assume you have like tips and tricks that an athlete can use, like prior to a race, or some sort of rituals. I'm sure that people go through as well. Like my one is pretty simple. Like if I am nervous, I just call it out. I just say, "Oh, I'm feeling nervous," and then I say the next sentence I say is, "That means I'm excited," or "That means I care." And I think even just getting the emotion out for me kind of helps reduce that kind of butterfly effect and just gets me more excited than nervous to the point that it would affect my performance.
Yeah, a lot of athletes try to suppress it, and they try to ignore it. And I think that's generally not the best way to go about it. I really like that you said just calling attention to it, giving it a name. And then even some cognitive reframing of like, I'm anxious, yes, but that means I'm excited, right? Like you said, that's a really powerful reframe that gets you to the starting line in a better headspace, as opposed to dwelling on the fact that you're feeling a bit anxious. When somebody has the butterfly feeling in their stomach, they got the butterflies flying around. I try to tell them to get the butterflies flying in formation. Like get them aligned. Yeah, and then they're gonna work for you. They're gonna work with you instead of against you.
I love it. That's such a great one. I'm going to steal that. You you mentioned on the podcast we love a good conversation about connection and community, but community did come up, right? You mentioned, so there is a cultural component to what you're doing as well, and what sport brings to. How much of endurance sport for you is about a sense of community, a sense of belonging versus performance?
Yeah, so much of it is about belonging. If that goes back to self-determination theory, right? That we need for intrinsic motivation to be present, we need autonomy, we need competence, and we need a sense of belonging. And that third leg of the stool, so to speak, is a big thing that I try to build here locally with my athletes, because as humans we thrive on connection. And that is coming from somebody who is very far on the introverted side of the spectrum. I can still appreciate the fact that we really need connection as human beings. I think it's one of the best antidotes to burnout. And the beautiful thing about endurance sport is that we have this shared struggle. It creates this bond that you really can't replicate anywhere else. It reminds us that we're not alone out there. We can do hard things together, and it's better when it's done together. So there's that shared suffering, there's the vulnerability, physical and mental and emotional vulnerability that comes out in endurance sport. And then of course there's just the mutual encouragement when you're part of a group. There's a lot of power, I think, in shared ritual. We have the group runs and the post-race stories and the time shared together on the trail. And it's really powerful, and it can be healing. I had an athlete who joined a local trail group not to improve their speed, but just for the connection piece. And their training consistency skyrocketed after that. And their performance improved as a side effect of that consistency. And it wasn't because their discipline changed. It's because they felt like they finally belonged to a community. And that got them out the door, and it had that nice side effect of improving their performance as well.
Yeah, it's such a great thing for building relationships or friendships or otherwise, like shared experiences. Especially, I'm sure we can all think of a time where we unfortunately went through hardship, but the bonds you build with people who are in there in the trenches, so to speak, with you as well. There is something very unique that brings people closer. And that was an interesting kind of, I wouldn't call it a case study, a person that you mentioned, right? Because the sense of belonging is definitely going to increase the amount of training they're going to do. But there's also an accountability aspect, which I think is important too. And we've all experienced it. If we have a gym buddy or someone we go on walks with or a team sport, you're more likely to attend than if you were just in isolation. You had to make like that hard decision every day just by yourself. If you had a buddy who's like, "Hey, come on, Podge, I'm down here now. Let's go for a walk." You're more likely to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the majority of my athletes are a bit more wired for doing things with a group or at least with one other person for that accountability piece. And I have a handful of athletes that really enjoy training by themselves and they like to just be able to push themselves and kind of be alone in their head for a little while. But even those athletes from time to time need that group connection. And I think it's really important to say that not all training groups are created equal. It really does matter the company that you keep. You know, you have to find the group that does make you feel that sense of belonging. And we I try hard with my athletes to create an inclusive environment that feels psychologically safe for them so that they can be themselves, they can have open conversations with each other. There's not a comparison game happening between athletes even though they're out doing the same kind of workout or they're on the track together and they can see that some athletes are faster than them and some are slower than them. We're trying to emphasize the connection piece over the comparison piece always.
Yeah, that's such a valid thing, and I can just imagine, like, you have group classes, but within that, everyone has their own individual goals or things they want to achieve, things are going on in their life as well. So it's not an easy group dynamic to manage, but I think that's the right way, right? The individual approach versus, like you said, you can go online and get a generic program, or it'd be like if everyone came to you and you all did the exact same thing with every athlete. It's not going to resonate with everyone at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, the big part of what I have learned in trying to create that psychological safety for athletes to open up to that experience is like modeling it in myself and trying to um, show athletes that I'm okay with being vulnerable. I'm okay with highlighting the fact that I fail at things all the time, you know, and that I have weaknesses, I have my own insecurities, and it's okay, you know? And, like, just being able to have those conversations of, like, where I am being vulnerable makes a huge difference in how much vulnerability other athletes share, you know, and open up to. And that has been a really powerful driver, I think, of the culture within our group specifically.
It's awesome. I know as well you talk a lot about durability as an endurance coach too. Like, how does this concept connect to mental resilience for you?
Yeah, the this piece is I think it's extremely important in performance. And I think it's often overlooked of like we think a lot about the physical durability and like how fit is an athlete. And there's a huge emphasis on the types of workouts that an athlete does and what their training was like and how many miles they ran, you know, but there's not a big emphasis on like how durable are you psychologically. And I think that's where the resilience piece comes in. And this is something that is very, very tricky to develop as a coach in my athletes. I think I'm still learning how to do this. And I noticed that some athletes come in with a higher baseline resilience than others. And a lot of that has to do with the experiences that they've had that have shaped them in their life. And, you know, for better or worse, the athletes that have been through more hardship generally have a higher baseline resilience than athletes who haven't experienced much hardship in their life up to that point. I don't think we can escape hardship, you know, in this lifetime. At some point, it's going to come around to all of us, but the timing of it really does impact a person's resilience. And endurance sport is naturally, it's kind of designed to make you more resilient, but in the process, it kind of breaks you down along the way. So there's this innate component to the sport where athletes are choosing to put themselves in a situation where they are forced to be resilient and adapt and grow, or they will not succeed. They will not cross the finish line. You know, so there's this is one of my favorite things about it, honestly, is just the fact that we can build resilience in such a direct way by just by doing endurance sports. And I see that growth happen in athletes over time. And that's one of my favorite parts about being a coach is like seeing athletes become more psychologically resilient. And that translates into other aspects of their life as well. They're able to handle critiques professionally better. They're able to be a more emotionally stable parent or partner at home because of the stability that they gain by doing hard things in their sport. So that it is not just one dimension here of, like, developing skills in sport. It has this transformative impact across all aspects of life, and I really love that.
Yeah, I'm the same. I think that's one of the things I love most about the sport I play. I kind of see it almost as, we'd say, a playground for almost like mentally improving, right? So when we're on a pitch, I mean, there's high stakes, right? You want to win the game, there's pressure, it's very real, it's there. But then at the end of the day, you win the game or you lose the game. Like life goes on, there's way more. But I just love it for that reason too. It's challenging you in like a safe, relatively safe, I know we can pick up injuries, but like a safe environment. And I love it for that aspect. And it seems like you get the exact same with the endurance running. And like you said, it has such a knock-on effect for other areas of your life too, whether it is with your work or with your family. If it's you're wanting to be present in the moment, that translates to all other aspects of your life.
Oh, yeah, yeah, and I do feel like it is a low stakes way of challenging yourself, right? At the end of the day, I'm not working with professional athletes, so it doesn't impact their salary, whether or not they successfully completed their workout that day or whether they got onto the podium at their race. It is a low stakes way of growing over time, building that resilience over time. And my hope is that when they do encounter something that is very challenging or even traumatic in life, that the things that they have gained from endurance sport make them more durable through that process, that they can handle the grief or the trauma or the loss, like just a little bit better. And I think that's an often, underappreciated aspect of sport.
Yeah, I fully agree. D, are you ready for some quick fire round questions on your coaching philosophy?
Yes, hit me.
All right. Question one. If someone is struggling with confidence, where should they start?
Ooh, this is supposed to be quick fire, but now you got
I
me
was just
thinking.
gonna say slow fire questions. No, take your time. I know it is pretty low.
This is a tough one. This is the problem I think that the majority of my athletes deal with is having low confidence or low self esteem. So I think we could always go back to like where is that stemming from. And usually what they're dealing with now or how it's presenting itself now is like an over focus, over emphasis of the numbers, the comparison trap that those things, I think you said this before, comparison is the thief of joy, right? Those things are going to take away the joy and they completely derail someone's confidence. So the number one thing that I do with athletes that don't have the confidence in themselves is give them little ways that they can win in training or even in racing. Like let's focus on little ways that we can build that confidence that are very low stakes or even no stakes ways of demonstrating competence. So if that goes back to that competence piece of one of the other legs of the stool of intrinsic motivation. Like let's build your confidence. Let's build yourself of like your sense of self-sufficiency, your autonomy, and build a community around you, ideally. If there's that sense of belonging piece. And then when all three of those things are present, I do see the confidence levels come up.
Yeah, I love it. There definitely the comparison piece is at the detriment of trying to build confidence. And I've noticed too in my coaching practice over the years, a lot of people are looking so far forward, they actually don't realize like what they have done. So even kind of asking those retroactive questions for me is like, hey, look, you were at this point in time, you've done this. So it's almost like putting money in the bank for them, Joe. Next thing they might realize, oh, like I am doing a lot of these things, maybe I am self-sufficient in that manner.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost like just taking a second to have some gratitude and to be proud of yourself for all the things that you have accomplished up to this point and looking back at all that data, those little wins that we've accumulated over time instead of dwelling on the little loss or that little mistake that you made or um, the negative thing, you know?
Curse you, negativity bias. Um, Question two: what are some psychological tools that you wish every athlete or adult athlete used?
Ooh, I think imagery is a really powerful one. Taking some time before a big performance or even before a hard training session and just taking a few minutes to visualize how you want to show up in that moment. And you can frame it as an entirely, ideal experience where you're gonna walk through that practice session or that race or that game and imagine yourself doing the everything really well. How do you want that to feel? How do you want it to look? Bring in all the senses. And then you can also take it in a more proactive direction and anticipate the things that could come up that can derail you, that will be challenging. Imagining like what you will do if X, Y, or Z happens in the middle of the game that's going to try to throw you off your game, right? And I think just taking the time to think through that can really ease someone's performance anxiety. Another one would
You're all.
talk.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, another one is self-talk of just I deal with a lot of athletes that are doing really long events, and eventually, at some point, you're going to have some negative thoughts that enter the equation. And it's not that we want to suppress them or just force them down and or ignore them. We want to acknowledge them, but then try to reframe them into something that is more productive. So there's going to be positive self talk. There's going to be negative self talk. But the more important thing is like, what is unproductive and what is productive? What can you tell yourself that's going to be more productive in that moment? And I think that is a quick way to reframe when you're in the moment and you start getting those negative thoughts spiraling around and um, trying to derail you.
Yeah, I love the idea of self talk. I will say from personal experience, you can't BS yourself either, right? So I've been in situations where whether it's positive or negative self talk, right? Um, I think in my own mind, maybe you can give me techniques to work around this. But if I am engaging in self talk, and let's say I haven't put in the work previously, so it might be I'm about to play a big game, but I know I haven't been consistent with my training. I know I'm lying to myself when I'm like, "Oh, you're the greatest, you can do it." I think there has to be a sense of realism too. And then there's been times where I've had a huge block of training behind me. I've done all the work, and then I have the self talk, and I can say to myself, "Yes, like you backed it up. You've been doing all this stuff, like you're ready." So I think there is something you have to kind of almost face yourself in the mirror as well when it comes to self talk and be realistic.
Yeah, it has to be honest. And I recently learned the difference between like motivational self talk and instructional self talk. And I used to not be a fan of self talk. I was like, oh, I can't just be positive and tell myself, oh yeah, you can do hard things or just keep going. You've got this. Right? I've never been a person that responds to that. I just don't believe myself when I say it. And the thing that really drives me is focusing more on like instructional self-talk. So I'm zeroing in on my movement. And maybe this is just the way my brain is wired, but I really like the technical aspects of form and, biomechanics and the way that I'm moving through space. And that helps me a lot when I am getting into a negative headspace and I can just go back to my form and my breathing and how am I landing and anticipating things on the trail, and I'm really just kind of coaching myself through that moment of like how to best approach the next section of the trail or how to control my breathing a little bit better so that I feel more calm, and that takes me out of that negative headspace into something that is more productive.
I love that. You're going back to your basics, back to your systems.
Mm,
We're gone full circle with the conversation.
exactly.
All right. Question three, the last one. What does a psychologically healthy athlete look like to you?
I think a psychologically healthy athlete has a really clear handle on how sport fits into their life. They have clarity on their identity. They're very self aware. They are purpose driven, a strong connection to their why. They have a love for the process and they are curious. They stay curious and open to possibilities of what's in front of them. And I think that is going to lead to the most sustainable and resilient kind of athlete. And taking that sort of orientation with your sport can be really deeply transformative over time.
Yeah, I think that really just encapsulates a lot of the pillars that you were speaking to throughout the conversation as well. Um, one last thing, I guess, before we go, what is one thing that you wish more adults maybe understood about themselves as athletes?
Mm, that vulnerability is not a weakness, that it is that initial cracking of the door of like what's inside of you, that is the area where you might have some weakness, some insecurity, some areas of vulnerability that we can address or at least become more self-aware of, that then we fortify, building a more durable, resilient athlete psychologically, and then that translates to performance on the outside. But I think if we neglect what's on the inside, which requires vulnerability, I think if we neglect that, then we're always going to miss out on that performance potential on the outside.
Yeah, there's like a almost like a hidden resistance that a lot of people might even know to be able to tap into that either.
Yeah. I see a lot of athletes that get so far in the sport and then they plateau and they can't get to that next level. And I think that often the missing piece between what separates the sub elite from the very elite is those that have really deeply tapped into that internal psychological piece to connect with that and address the areas that are psychologically weak inside them or that are those deeper performance barriers for themselves. And that is what allows them to get to that next level.
Yeah, such a differentiator, and it's no wonder that you are currently studying in that area as we speak.
Can you tell I'm fascinated by it?
Oh, I'm fascinated. I can feel the passion coming through the screen, D. It's wonderful. That was an incredibly quick hour. I feel like I could talk to you for hours about this stuff. But for those listeners out there who are still interested and want to learn more, where can they find you regarding your coaching or even Zeal Endurance?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Zeal Endurance Coaching, and my website is zealendurancecoaching.com. And there's a local group that I work with out of Boulder, Colorado, but I also coach remotely, and I'm always happy to meet new people and chat about coaching concepts, all these topics that we talked about today. I can honestly go on and on for hours.
Absolutely. I can see it. Dee, that was absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate your time as well. I will have the link to your website, and if there's any kind of social media profiles that you want to link as well, they're all going to be there when the episode comes out.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. That's all for today, folks. We'll talk to you all again soon. Thanks a million, Dee. Bye.